College football nerds, feels like we just saw y'all a few hours ago because we did. We did a 3-hour live show in the middle of the end of the game we're about to talk about, and that's Clemson and Georgia. So if y'all want, that game is available for replay on YouTube, but we're also going to put it out, the whole thing in podcast form. You can find us on Spotify, Google, Apple, those wonderful places. So we'll put links in the description for that if you want to listen to the whole thing on your commute this week. It was awesome. It was a ton of fun. There were a lot of great questions, and we're going to do it, for the near future. We're going to try to do that every Saturday night. So I think we're planning on doing it again this Saturday night, 10 p.m. Eastern. We might adjust the time here or there, but right now that's kind of what we're looking at. So Josh, we missed this one. We picked Clemson. You actually covered, but we did miss this one in our preview that we did. And I really just want to open this up with, like a lot of people are going to say that we completely missed this. I've already seen that in the comments. That's really not the case, but we were wrong. And like we're going to do to LSU fans when we take our victory lap, we also going to show up for our L's as well. So talk about really kind of what we got wrong and maybe even what we got right.
I think the biggest thing we got wrong in this game was the fact that we thought that there would actually be offensive production. Looking into it, I know I didn't. Did you have any expectation that this game was going to be dominated by defense to the just massive extent that it was?
I don't think anybody did, and that was the theme in week one, but I don't think anybody saw 10-3.
Yeah, I had it 30-28 Clemson, which means I had Georgia in the points, but I had Clemson straight up. And some people actually thought I had a low score in the 30s or 20s for, quote, elite teams in the offense that they bring. And what we got instead was, 10-3 in a game that felt in a lot of ways like watching 2011 Alabama LSU, where there was just elite defensive play all over the field, and the offenses couldn't really do much of anything. Something we discussed, I think 3 different times in that preview, was that this was probably the best collection of interior defensive line talent in the country. But as much as we talked about it, somehow we managed to still give it short shrift, because the reality of this game was the interior D-lines dominated to an just almost absurd extent, particularly Georgia's defensive line. And we both mentioned that if somebody could handle the other side's D-line, that they would probably be the one to win. What I don't think we really anticipated was, what happens when one side can't in any way possibly cope with the other side's interior D-line? Because Clemson's offensive line, they weren't just struggling with Georgia's interior D-line. They were getting dominated the way a mid-tier G5 gets dominated by a team like Alabama or Georgia. And I did not expect them to be just so woefully inadequate that it effectively broke any semblance of balance or consistency to their offense.
Yeah, we actually talked a lot in our live show, so some of this will be a rehash for those of you that were on it. DJ Uiagalelei was getting killed by the comments and everybody about how ineffective he was. But one of the things you pointed out was that offensive line was getting dominated, and they weren't able to run the ball at all. They had a negative rushing yards. I don't know if it was for the game, but in the fourth quarter, they had negative rushing yards up until that point. So that tells you that you can't scheme and put the whole thing on his shoulders and expect to win a ball game. So I think that people talking about he's trash, he's overrated, all of this, it is way premature. One thing I will say, though, and I said it last night, it's inexcusable that Clemson's offensive line is continually a problem. It's continually like they're bad, and coming into the season, they're not good. We've heard this before. That's inexcusable given the level and the standard that Clemson's at. Okay, so one of the things that I want to touch on, because I heard this a lot yesterday, we saw a lot of really bad offense yesterday. A lot of low scores, a lot of bad offenses from top-tier teams that normally score a bunch of points. And there was some comparisons to the Penn State-Wisconsin game. And yes, don't get me wrong, there was some bad offense in the Clemson-Georgia game. But at least in comparison to Penn State and Wisconsin, Clemson and Georgia were both trying to be creative and get their playmakers the ball in space. It's just that the defense, especially especially the front seven, was able to adjust and accommodate with a short passing game, short space plays, and really swallow them up. Whereas Wisconsin and Penn State, it was run up the middle, incomplete pass on 3rd and 7. And that's not what we saw in Georgia and Clemson. We saw an elevated level of defense. Now, I'm not giving them a free pass. I think both of these teams still have some concerns. But, Josh, if you're a Georgia fan right now, there's a little more hope and optimism with your offense, I think, if you're going to have to play another elite defense, based on the fact that Georgia was limited somewhat maybe by their own, lacking, but also the fact that they had some guys out. So maybe talk about that a little bit too.
The biggest reason that we picked Clemson in this game is we thought the two teams would score. And if they were scoring, we felt like the missing starters for Georgia was going to be the impact that, caused Clemson to win. I don't think we were wrong to think the missing starters were going to affect Georgia. I think they really felt they felt the fact that Washington was out. They didn't quite have an answer, I think, for who they wanted to go to with the wide receiver position. And, we talked about how, be it Jackson and Burton and all these other guys have been banged up. And I know they've been practicing. But, look, if you've been out for weeks in fall camp, it takes a while to shake that rust off. And I think that showed. I don't think we were wrong to make that analysis. The problem was we were assuming this was going to be a game in the 20s, right? That these were two offenses that were going to move the ball fairly well. And the lack of receivers ended up being something that kind of helped prevent Georgia from getting going, rather than being the thing that held them back by 7 to 10 points versus where I thought they would be. Because I really feel like if Georgia had been healthy, and I think I made this pretty clear, I probably would have picked Georgia. But with those guys out, I thought they'd be limited. And I mean, we have to be real about something else, and this is probably something to talk on. Georgia got the W, okay? And I want to cut that whole discussion off. They got the W. They won this fair and square. They were the better team statistically. They were the better team on the field. They won this game. But, if you shift to talking about what Georgia is going to look like, on one hand, you talk about, I think they're going to get better offensively because they're going to get some of those receivers back and they're going to get gel a little better. But you also have to consider the fact that, that as it may be, the only touchdown scored in this game was an interception. Georgia didn't score a touchdown either on offense. So how concerning is that going forward? I mean, can you realistically depend on beating SEC teams by scoring defensive scores without offensive points? Because there's going to be a game where, something bad happens. You muff a punt and you throw a pick six, or the other, you bust a coverage and the other team blocks a punt and Kentucky gets 14 points on you. And you're going to have to be able to score 20 points consistently in high level play to win. And I mean, do we feel like when those guys come back that they're going to be able to do that on a consistent basis? I think that's a fair question going forward.
It is, but I also think that as much as it's not fair to say, well, last year they did this and that, they did do this and that last year. They did score points last year. Cincinnati was a good defense last year. They scored enough to win that game. They put up points. I'm not that concerned because I thought the running game actually looked okay last night. They were able to run some where Clemson was able to run none. And as much as we've given JT Daniels a hard time, with him having guys out, I still felt like, even especially the fact that he had guys out, I liked what I saw in terms of his decisiveness, first and second read, a lot more than what I saw from DJ Uiagalelei. He was getting the ball out quick, looked like he had a live arm. I think they'll be able to score points against anybody that wasn't an elite front seven, right? I think anybody that's not an Alabama, Clemson, maybe Ohio State, though they got linebacker issues, Georgia's going to get some points. And the flip side of that is, and I'll let you talk on this, what we saw from the Georgia defense, it doesn't look like they're going to have to score that many points to win ball games, given how good that defense looked.
Yeah, and I was hoping you'd go there because I was raising the question, but I was kind of baiting the answer. And the answer is, yeah, sure. And JT Daniels had a lower yard per attempt average than Uiagalelei did in that game. 4.5 yards per attempt to 4.8, both through a pick. But the difference is Georgia could actually run the ball. I mean, they finished about 4 yards a carry, which isn't great, but Milton was 4.5 yards per carry. Cook was 3.8. White finished 5.7. And on the other side of the ball with Clemson, Shipley and Pace ended 1.8 yard per carry. 2 total yards rushing in a game. 2 yards on 23 carries. And that's the thing that I think is encouraging for Georgia, because there are very few teams, if anyone really, outside of Clemson and Georgia, that is that good at stopping the run. And so if Georgia can get 4 yards of carry in this game, they're going to get like 5 yards of carry or more in any other. And at that point, the other team isn't going to be able to play so tight on the pass.
And shifting gears just a little bit, and thinking about the rest of the season. For Georgia, let's think about like who they're going to play this year that's going to even challenge them in that regard. We saw yesterday, like Florida looked bad offensively against not a defense that should matter. And they did have to rely on the run a lot, weren't able to move it through the air, which is going to be a disaster against this Georgia defense. Alabama is the only team that I see that can even challenge them. And I love overreacting and making long-term predictions in week 1, so let's do that. If Georgia goes undefeated, given what we now have seen with North Carolina and Miami getting bombed by Alabama, I know we said that this wasn't an elimination game for the loser, but based on what we saw from Clemson, and what we've seen from the other 2 teams that are supposed to be good in the ACC, if Georgia and Alabama are undefeated in the SEC championship game, unless Notre Dame runs the table, I have a hard time believing that the loser of that game doesn't get in. And I know you hate hypotheticals, but in the least you can agree that Georgia really set themselves up for a great season and have a little bit of room to play with right now.
I totally agree. We talk a lot when you're doing playoff projections. It's not really so much about what you've done as it is what the other options are on the table. That's always the mistake people talk about with why did X team get in when they didn't even win their division. Well, it's probably because that everybody else screwed up. And Washington losing to Montana means they're out, period. They are out. That they can't get in. Oregon has to play Ohio State, so they can't both be undefeated. Oklahoma and Texas have to play each other, and that puts in a position where I think the Pac-12 is done. And so maybe you get the Big Ten champion, maybe you get the Big 12 champion, and then it's the ACC champion and the SEC fighting for 2 slots. Well, if Georgia's already beaten Clemson and Georgia goes into the SEC championship game undefeated, Georgia is not going to be left out over Clemson. I don't care if they're a conference champ when they've won head-to-head. So like you said, Notre Dame is the wild card. I will say Cincinnati is a little bit of a wild card, but I don't think that they're going to get the credit over.
I mean, they play Notre Dame, though.
Yeah, I mean, if Notre Dame is the one wild card here really is if Cincinnati and Notre Dame are both really, really good, one of them goes undefeated beating the other. I think that team might be what keeps the SEC from getting 2 in. And that's only if really the Big Ten and Big 12 champions are undefeated. But there's a lot of ifs there, and by and large, those 3 conferences do not produce 3 undefeated teams. So I think it's very likely if Georgia and Alabama both make the SEC championship game undefeated, they will both make it into the playoff. I think there's probably about an 80% chance of that happening.
Yeah, and there's a lot of talk about – I've seen a lot of takes on rankings. Like, you can't rank Georgia at number 2 right now, right behind Alabama, because they only scored 3 points. Look, Georgia beat an elite team yesterday. Anybody else want to raise their hand in, D1 football that beat an elite team yesterday? Okay, next step down. Anybody besides Alabama want to talk about how awesome they felt about their win yesterday? You got Iowa. You got who else? Like UCLA. That's it, right? And are we going to really bet that either one of those teams is beating Georgia right now? No. So. I quoted somebody on Twitter because they were, bashing somebody for having Ohio State in the top 5. And they're like, you can't put Ohio State up there. Look, if you're not going to put Georgia at 2, if you're not going to put Ohio State in the top 5 based on the flaws they had in their game last night, then you got to tell me who goes ahead of them. It's easy to say they don't belong there because they have these flaws, X, Y, and Z. Also, most of the people watching the game last night don't realize who Georgia was missing. But you got to tell me who you're putting ahead of Georgia. And right now, like, we haven't done a top 10 yet, and we haven't seen Notre Dame play. I want to put that out there. Notre Dame, Florida State game hasn't happened yet. But Josh, tell me, like, if you're ranking right now, it's not just like we have to do some hypothetical because it's still week 1, but like, is there any possible chance that Georgia's not in your top 2?
It's something I would consider, but I mean, they've got to be very squarely in the conversation. I mean, the only thing you got to think about is like, okay, how much do I think the Ohio State games or the Oklahoma games were a fluke? All 3 of them have their own flaws, but Georgia having a flaw of really struggling in the passing game against Clemson is a heck of a lot more excusable than Oklahoma failing to put away Tulane, or Ohio State really struggling badly on defense and offensively actually really struggling in the passing game. I know they had decent yardage at the end of the day, but it was mainly busted wide open plays. They didn't have any consistency whatsoever. And they're playing Minnesota, who was a horrid defense last year, and I think probably is a horrid defense this year. But to your point, look, everything right now is still really up in the air. And, Illinois beat Nebraska, and people were saying, oh, well, Nebraska, are they really bad, or is Illinois really good? And then Illinois turned around, and who was it, like Sam Houston State that just beat them or something? Somebody not very good. I forget who even the team was right off the bat. But, yeah, I mean, what we'll find out in the next couple weeks is, I have almost assured you that Clemson and Georgia are both going to look a lot better in retrospect 6 weeks down the road, because we're going to find out that, Clemson is still Clemson, and they're still really good. And Georgia is Georgia, and they're really good. And that excuses Clemson for losing somewhat, and it excuses Georgia for the fact that they couldn't dominate this game. And no one else really can say that. You just simply can't lose that perspective.
And that's what I think we could end this on is like, look, whatever you're going to say about Georgia and Clemson, remember, they were playing each other. They weren't playing Tulane yesterday. They weren't playing whoever Texas A&M was playing yesterday. And if you didn't watch that Florida game or that Texas A&M game, then you don't know how bad they look. And then they could be North Carolina, who scored 10 points on Virginia Tech. So we always talk about like how things scale offensively. And if you have a little bit of a drop back from an elite plus defense to just a very good defense, that opens up a wealth of opportunity for the opposing offense to look a whole lot better, even against a very good defense, which I think we're going to see from Georgia. I still got some question marks if they're playing in Alabama tomorrow, but they've got time to work it out. But I do think that, okay, they struggled against an elite plus. Let's see, you give them a good defense, they might put up 30 or 40. We don't know. So I think it's a little too early to judge Georgia's offense entirely. But one thing we know, that defense is legit. All right, y'all, let us know in the comments what you think. Are you concerned about Georgia's offense as they get a chance to grow throughout the season, or do you think it was just more about the opponent they faced? Remember, if you want to catch the live show we did Saturday night, it's out there on the podcast sphere, and it'll also be available on our channel, 3 hours long. We were super tired, but we're back at it today. Thanks so much, y'all. Have a great week, and God bless.